Let me be clear from the outset, this isn't about superstition, and it certainly isn't about arbitrary dates on a calendar. July 1, 2025 is not simply a number. It represents a psychological and existential threshold. It's a symbolic, and perhaps literal, deadline for transformation. Now, that may sound dramatic, even conspiratorial to some, but let's examine the underlying structure of what we're facing. Human beings operate on cycles. Biological, social, spiritual, and civilizations follow suit. These cycles accumulate tension, disruption, and renewal. We're standing on the cusp of one such turning point. The indicators are everywhere if you're willing to look: rising global polarization, the breakdown of trust in institutions, the acceleration of artificial intelligence beyond ethical frameworks, ecological degradation, and perhaps most alarmingly, a widespread psychological crisis. Alienation, anxiety, nihilism. None of this is random. July's 01 is not about catastrophe, it's about culmination. It marks a convergence point, a fork in the road, and what happens in the months leading up to it. How we orient ourselves morally, spiritually, psychologically, will determine whether we emerge from this period stronger and more integrated or fractured beyond recognition. The mythological hero's journey always involves a moment where the familiar world begins to dissolve, and the protagonist must choose to either act decisively or be swallowed by chaos. We're collectively approaching that moment. From a psychological standpoint, this deadline forces us to confront something uncomfortable: the avoidance of responsibility. Carl Jung spoke of the shadow, that part of ourselves we refuse to look at, and therefore project onto the world. The tension of our age is that the collective shadow is swelling. We see it in online outrage mobs, in ideological fanaticism, in our inability to tolerate ambiguity or nuance. July 01 represents a call to individuation, Jung's term for becoming whole. But individuation is painful. It requires shedding illusions, dismantling comforting narratives, and accepting the weight of our freedom. From a philosophical lens, we might say this is a return to the existential dilemma that thinkers like Kierkegaard and Nietzsche articulated: the burden of choice in absurd or even indifferent universe. Except now the absurdity is amplified by noise. Digital, political, social, make it even harder to choose something authentic. And yet that's exactly what must happen. We must choose. Not react, not conform, but consciously align with what we believe is meaningful and true. So why this urgency? Why this date? Because passivity has an expiry date. There comes a time when delay becomes a decision, when indecision becomes betrayal of ourselves, of our future, of the people we'll inherit what we either saved or destroyed. July 01 is not the beginning or the end. It's a mirror. And what we see in it depends entirely on who we've chosen to become between now and then. You have time, but not forever. And the truth is, the window is closing faster than we'd like to admit. Now the phrase, chosen ones, might strike some as inflated or even delusional, and I understand that instinct. We've been conditioned, especially in the modern secular West, to flatten distinctions, to treat everyone as interchangeable parts in a broader, mechanistic system. But reality doesn't conform to that utopian ideal. Hierarchies exist, of competence, of awareness, of responsibility. And some people, whether by temperament, suffering, vision, or deep inner orientation toward truth, are called to carry a heavier burden. That's who I'm speaking to now. You don't need to be told you're different. You already know. You've probably spent years feeling out of place, not because you're broken, but because you're awake in a culture that rewards sedation. You've noticed patterns others ignore. You've resisted the cheap comforts of mass entertainment, ideological simplicity, and moral laziness. That resistance, painful though it may be, is the very sign that you were not meant to sleep through this moment in history. You're not a spectator. You're a participant in a far deeper drama. Psychologically speaking, what we're talking about is the emergence of the hero archetype in the modern individual. Now, that doesn't mean grandiosity or messiah complexes. Those are distortions. I'm talking about the sincere, often reluctant, awakening to responsibility. The sense that you are being summoned, not externally by some institution or movement, but internally by the voice of conscience. And that voice doesn't lie. It doesn't flatter. It demands, it says, hey, you can see what others cannot. So act accordingly, from a philosophical standpoint. It's a confrontation with meaning, not as an abstraction, but as something you must embody. Viktor Frankl, the psychiatrist who survived the Nazi concentration camps, wrote that meaning is not something we ask of life, but something life asks of us. The chosen are the ones who feel that question burning in their soul. Why am I here? What is required of me? And most importantly, what happens if I do nothing? We're at a stage in history where knowledge alone is no longer sufficient. Everyone has access to information, billions of data points, endless content. But what's rare, dangerously rare, is wisdom, discernment, the ability to orient oneself in the storm of noise and act with integrity. The ones who can do that, they're not just lucky, they're forged, often through suffering, alienation, even despair. But instead of collapsing, they emerge stronger. That's the mark of the chosen. Not superiority, but responsibility earned. So if you're hearing this and it resonates, not just intellectually, but viscerally, then you already know who you are. You've always known. And the only question now is whether you're ready to stop waiting for permission. Because here's the uncomfortable truthing: no one is coming to save you. No government, no movement, no ideology. It's on you. And that's terrifying, but it's also the source of your power. You're not here to fit in, you're here to stand up. The difficulty with today isn't that it's hidden, it's that it's buried. Buried under layers of distraction, ideological noise, digital addiction, and emotional manipulation. We're not just misinformed, we're overwhelmed. That's a different kind of danger altogether. When people are misinformed, there's at least a path to correction, through reason, evidence, or dialogue. But when people are overwhelmed, they retreat, they shut down, they become cynical, passive, and numb. And that, psychologically speaking, is the soil where tyranny grows. Now think about how this plays out in your day-to-day life. Every time you scroll through a feed designed to hijack your attention, you're participating, perhaps unwillingly, in a system optimized to keep you mentally fragmented and spiritually disoriented. And while you're focused on surface-level outrage, who's tread what, which side to hate today, something much deeper is being lost in your capacity for sustained attention, for inner stillness, for moral clarity. That's not an accident. That's a design. You might ask, designed by who? But that's the wrong question. This isn't a conspiracy in the cartoonish sense. It's a convergence of incentives. Technological, political, economic, that all benefit from keeping the average person distracted, divided, and dependent. Philosophers like Aldous Huxley warned about this decades ago. Not a boot stamping on a human face forever, but a society that would anesthetize itself with pleasure, novelty, and triviality, bread and circuses. But in our case, it's memes and dopamine loops. The real tragedy, though, is that in the midst of this informational flood, the truths that actually matter, the ones that could unify, awaken, and empower, are not just ignored. They're actively ridiculed. Moral courage, personal responsibility, spiritual depth, these are dismissed as outdated or worse, dangerous. Because the moment you start thinking independently, you become unpredictable. And unpredictable people are harder to control. Let's be blunting: the systems around you are not built to help you grow. They're built to keep you manageable. But here's the paradox. They can only do that if you cooperate. If you trade your inner compass for external validation. If you allow yourself to be emotionally manipulated into binary thinking, or right, good or evil, victim or villain. These labels are too simplistic to hold the complexity of reality. But they persist because they serve a function. They keep you from asking deeper questions. And that's exactly where the chosen come in. Your task, if you're willing to accept it, is not to shout louder than the noise. It's to see through it. to recognize the difference between signal and static. That requires discipline, discernment, and often solitude. It's not glamorous, but it's essential. Because if the can see refuse to speak, and the people who can speak refuse to act, then the culture sinks. Slowly, quietly, and with frightening consent. So here's the challenge, and don't be another voice in the echo chamber. Be the silence that reveals the truth. Responsibility is the antidote to despair. That's not a pudic idea. It's a psychological truth. When people lose a sense of meaning or stability, they often spiral into chaos internally. And the only thing that reliably halts the descent isn't comfort or distraction or someone else fixing the problem for them. It's taking up a burden that is heavy enough to matter, but not so heavy that it crushes you. That's where you begin. That's what must be done now, before the window closes. We're in a time where everything is being questioned. Our systems, our values, even the nature of reality itself. For most people, that produces anxiety. But for those with eyes to see, it reveals an opportunity, an open space in which something new can be built. But nothing new will emerge without individuals who are willing to step into the unknown and order it. That's the ancient story repeated in every mything. Confront the chaos, extract the potential, and bring it back into the world as something transformative. But that process starts with the individual. That's you. It's not enough. Know what's going on. It's not enough to be aware of the patterns or critique the failures of others. You have to orient yourself. Morally, spiritually, practically. The world doesn't need more cynics. It needs people who can carry weight without becoming bitter, who can see the darkness without becoming it, who can articulate what they believe, not because it's popular, but because it's true. So what do you do concretely? First, tell the truth. And I don't mean that abstractly. I mean every day in your conversations, in your work, in your inner dialogue. Stop saying things that make you weak. Stop agreeing to things that you know are false. Stop performing for approval. That sounds simple, but it's extremely difficult because we've all become accustomed to lying to ourselves and to others just to keep the peace or preserve comfort. But peace built on falsehood is not peace. It's quiet corruption. Second, cultivate yourself. That means discipline. That means structure. That means facing your flaws and deciding to grow anyway. If you haven't established routines that reinforce your values, do it now, not later, not when it's convenient. Now, you cannot stand firm in a collapse if yourself are scattered and distracted. Third, connect. Not performatively, not virtually, genuinely. Reach out to those who are also awake, not just to agree, but to sharpen each other, to hold each other accountable, to build something resilient together. Isolation is a weapon. It weakens resolve. But mutual commitment, among a few, not many, can shift the course of history. None of this is easy, and it's not supposed to be. You're not being asked to be perfect. You're being asked to be willing to engage with your life, your moment, your role, as though it matters, because it does. If you don't carry the weight that's meant for you, it doesn't disappear. It falls on someone weaker. Let's be brutally honest. There are consequences for inaction. Not just external ones, but internal, spiritual, and psychological. We often fool ourselves into believing that standing still is somehow neutral, that waiting is safe, or that withholding action until we're certain is virtuous. But that's a dangerous illusion, because in times of crisis, passivity is not neutrality. It's complicity. Every time you avoid a difficult truth, or delay a hard decision, or stay silent when you know something needs to be said, a part of you begins to erode. You start to lose the integrity of your own voice. And over time, that erosion becomes harder to reverse. You get used to bending. You rationalize it. You tell yourself you're being patient or strategic or peaceful. But what you're really doing is abandoning the part of you that knows how to stand upright in a collapsing world. Now multiply that by millions. Millions of people, each waiting for someone else to take responsibility. That's how societies decay. Not through a single moment of catastrophe, but through a collective drift into apathy. And by the time the consequences manifest externally, broken families, spiritual emptiness, institutional rot, it's already too late to trace the origin, because the real collapse happened inside long before it appeared on the surface. Psychologically, this is what Jung warned us about when he spoke of the shadow. Not the evil out there, but the darkness we refuse to confront within ourselves. When that shadow is not acknowledged, it doesn't disappear, it grows. And eventually, it takes over in ways we can't control. It becomes collective madness, mob thinking, dehumanization, ideological possession. We've seen this in history again and again, and yet we're arrogant enough to think we're immune. There's also a philosophical layer here, and it's existential. You were not given consciousness to coast. You were not granted awareness so you could remain comfortable. That's not how meaning works. Meaning demands engagement, struggle, sacrifice. And if you reject that burden, you don't remain free. You become hollow. That's the great lie of modern culture, is the absence of obligation. But real freedom comes only when you willingly shoulder responsibility. Anything else is just indulgence masquerading as liberation. And if the so-called chosen don't answer this call, if those who can see refuse to act, then what right do we have to expect anything better? We become the very people we once criticized. The ones who looked the other way, meant well, but did nothing. Who had every chance to speak and chose silence. So yes, there are consequences. Maybe not immediately. Maybe not in some visible apocalyptic way. But the real loss will be quieter and far more tragic. It will be the knowledge that you were called and you turned away. If you refuse the burden, you may avoid the pain. But you also forfeit the meaning. There's something remarkable, almost paradoxical, about the structure of transformation. On one hand, it demands suffering, sacrifice, and the courage to face chaos. But on the other, if you endure that confrontation with honesty and discipline, what lies beyond is not merely survival. It's transcendence. It's not just about avoiding catastrophe. It's about emerging from the trial as something new, something more integrated, more whole. That is the opportunity on the other side of this threshold we're approaching. The burden we've been talking about, of responsibility, of truth, of conscious action, isn't punishment. It's the path to meaning. And the thing about meaning is that it sustains you. It doesn't insulate you from pain, but it makes the pain worthwhile. It gives structure to the chaos. It transforms you from someone tossed around by the world into someone capable of shaping it. That's the reward. Not comfort, not applause, but strength. Character. A self that you can actually respect when you're alone and honest. And imagine what happens if enough people accept that invitation. If enough individuals begin to live in alignment with truth, rather than convenience. Cultures don't regenerate from the top down. They revive from the inside out. From individuals willing to carry the fire, even when everything around them is cold and indifferent. This is why your personal development is not just a private affair. Your courage, your discipline, your voice, those things ripple outward. They influence your family, your community, even the stranger who overhears your words and quietly decides to stop pretending. Psychologically, this is the deepest form of integration. You stop outsourcing your values to broken systems. You stop waiting for rescue. You begin acting as though your life matters, because it does. And in doing so, you experience the strange and powerful effect of coherence, where your thoughts and your words and your actions begin to align. That's not ego. And from integrity comes influence. The real kind, not performative or manipulative, but grounded, moral, and enduring. So what's on the other side of July 01? That depends entirely on how we show up between now and then. It could be more noise, more fear, more collapse. That's always an option. But it could also be the beginning of something very different. A turning point, subtle at first, but unmistakable in hindsight. A moment when people stopped to pretend they didn't know what was happening and started becoming who they were meant to be. The world is starving for people who are awake, humble, and unshakably courageous. And the truth is, those people are not born. They're often in silence, often through pain, always by choice. If you rise now, you won't just survive the shift. You'll help shape what comes after.